So today I got to interview a wonderful practitioner, Lauren from the Beyond the Veil podcast. So if you guys would just do me a huge favor, give her a warm welcome, definitely check out all of her links down below and give her podcast a listen. I'm going to be on it at some point in the future, and I will totally announce that around like closer to the premiere date. But Lauren's podcast really has a lot to do with kind of like death work and also some like she touches on some ancestor work, which are things that I know that you guys are really interested in. So I learned a lot from her. Hopefully you guys can learn a lot from her. And without further ado, let's hop over to the interview.
Alrighty, so as you guys can see, I am joined by a wonderful guest today. So I am going to give her the floor and let her introduce herself.
Hello. My name is Lauren. You could find me on Instagram at beyondtheveil_podcast. The main way I kind of create content I guess in many ways, it kind of touches on a lot of things, intellectual, spiritual, cultural, is through a podcast called Beyond the Veil. And so I independently research, host, and edit that podcast. And I discuss any and all death-related topics that resonate with my personal journey. Things like how to process grief after physical deaths of loved ones, spooky history, because I really love history and I like looking at things that, might not find in your history textbooks growing up, analysis of cultural and media representations of death, as well as more spiritual ideas for engaging with death too, or like even the death archetype I find super fascinating. So a little bit spiritual, a little bit intellectual, and it's kind of like my inquiry journal where I just kind of explore and discover things, and I don't position myself as like an expert or anything. But it's really just my way of putting into practice and holding myself accountable to developing the discomfort and unraveling the discomfort around death. So really creating a space for that and doing it so in a way that is pretty vulnerable, pretty honest, and allows me to be able to connect with amazing people like you.
Oh my gosh, well, thank you. I'm so glad to have you here chatting with me and on my channel. Now, a lot of the content that I make is geared towards witchcraft and kind of that world of spirituality and paganism. Would you describe yourself as a witch, or how do you describe your personal spiritual practice, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, I think I definitely would probably identify myself as probably falling under that umbrella of like witchcraft. It's something that I have explored since a very young age. I think we all relate to this idea of going to our public libraries as young people and going to that like older section of the library, the occult section, and looking at things and knowing somehow deep down it wasn't the norm, but like still yet really curious and following that really young, pure, like intuition, and then going to like Barnes and Noble, that bookstore, and looking at other things and creating like your little grimoire, your book of shadows. I remember I have mine like in a little binder. So I've had like a roundabout journey back to that, and I think it's in those really big moments, even like liminal spaces in your life, you really do have to come back to your roots and places of comfort. Oftentimes those places are things you've kind of encountered in your youth. And so for me, yes, definitely probably would fall under that category of witchcraft, but also like very death centric. Like it's very, the purpose of my spiritual practices at this point in my life is really to engage with the things I don't give myself enough space to in my day-to-day life, really bringing that to the front and center in a very conscious, intentional way. So very exploratory, and very much trying to address transition, change, insecurity, and emotional instability. All those things I think manifests and play itself out in like the death archetype when you think about them collectively. So whether it's the death archetype or literally trying to address my grief from like physical deaths of people, that is what I've been kind of exploring and dabbling in as of late.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. That was kind of my next question. I was going to ask, like, how does this death work really intersect with your personal practice? And like, do you have any specific examples, any sort of like spell work that you're kind of focused on right now or anything like that?
There is a wide range of things, and that's what I love about my podcast, is that I get to kind of think about what is that thing I need to be addressing right now in my life. And I kind of have a goal of creating one podcast a month. So last month I created an episode about cemetery meditations, because I really have set this like death positive resolution to go visit my dad's gravesite at least once every season. So I need to go this summer. But for spring in February, I was able to find a really great meditation, cemetery meditation from the book Light Magic for Dark Times, or During Dark Times, by Lisa Marie Basile. And then I kind of set that goal to incorporate that into my next visit with him. And so I kind of debriefed on that, and just thinking about how I like, just it's occurring to me right now how like really open and vulnerable that is. But to do that so publicly and not even know who's like listening to me. But that's kind of the goal of my podcasts, is to speak about something that's taboo like death, and to kind of embrace it and understand that that is like my truth, and that it is not something to feel weird or strange about, but I'm still getting there. But yeah, so then I had a podcast about that experience, and then looked at what I've already known about cemetery work and that energy. And I've gone to a few really great virtual webinars where people have shared their experiences as death witches, talking about how they interact with like plant allies and how they visit, like what's that etiquette, what's that routine for going to cemeteries. So kind of just consolidated what I knew at that point with that episode. And I love looking at the death archetype as well. So I know that I was following a lot of your like winter solstice work that you shared, and a lot of your videos and content and postings, and looking at how that time is so crucial for setting up this new like version of yourself, and what you want to like let go of, and what you were kind of like planting, and what you're making space for, and what we were trying to make some room for to become, or to kind of plant those seeds. So I did a lot of work in December and January that I think really helped have a more smoother transition into spring. And I've done a little bit more of like that on a micro level. So a lot of like looking at nature in a really gentle, sensitive way, because I come from a framework of seeing from like a cultural analysis, very like anthropological, our societal views in relationship to death. Like there's a lot that's working to keep us disconnected from the natural rhythms of life. So whether it's honoring the waxing and the waning of like the lunar cycles, or it is putting intention into like keeping relationships with people who have passed on, I find all of that to be very radical against the systems that are in place today that benefit from that, monetarily especially, and to be able to like kind of like push narratives I've kind of been initiated into that I actually don't want to uphold, like this idea that I think is pretty, and I'm bringing in a lot of my like critical theories here, but like I feel like it's very colonial to like think that like people's spirits just die when they physically aren't embodied anymore. So like trying to wrap my head around something I feel like I intuitively know, and like having to kind of like let myself cognitively accept those things that spiritually I feel like sits right, but my brain sometimes doesn't want to like accept those things. So I love being able to like have spaces like an ancestor altar where I have like a photo of my dad, and I like have relationships I build with him, even though, you know, there's nobody really like talking back to me except maybe like in dreams occasionally. So it's something that takes various forms, whether it's literally having a relationship with somebody who is deceased, or looking at the many ways that I am dying on a daily basis, if that makes sense, like energetically, and the waxing and the waning of things. I think it all is in service of becoming more of like a death positive person.
So it kind of feels like, and correct me if I'm wrong, like what I'm understanding is that you're kind of like like recentering your focus on like deconstructing this really big theme that we all kind of have to deal with at one point or another. And one of my favorite things that you talk about is death positivity. So I guess like my next question is like, how do you like define death positivity, and like why do you feel like it is so important? Because I don't talk about that kind of stuff a whole lot on my channel, but I feel like you have a really great explanation and like great grasp on the concept. I would love for myself and my viewers to like learn from you about this.
I feel like I have noticed that like you maybe don't like overtly talk about it, but I feel like you do. Like I feel like a lot of like what I've understood about death and dying and all those things, like I feel like you have like there's a lot I've gathered from you. So I really appreciate you sharing on those things. It kind of peeks through it here and there. But I think death positivity is so important because death is always with us. The more I think about death and the more I like let myself feel death, because I think there's a difference there between thinking about death and like letting yourself actually feel it, the more you become more conscious of it. Like I remember a few months ago realizing that like I'm walking on this street and there's like dead leaves, like I'm literally stepping on death, like it's all around us, and yet we feel so disconnected from it. So that was kind of a big aha moment for me there, that like I am feeling, even in those small moments, 1 inch, like one tiny piece closer to like kind of accepting it and like acknowledging it. So I think there's just a lot of emotional discomfort that I've experienced in my life that originates from the discomfort of things ending. And whether it's like a loved one's life, a dream that never got to be, lived out, a hope of how a future life would be that's never going to come to fruition, a relationship lost, whether romantic or a friendship, the list goes on. It's like, how do you make friends with that reality that like things end and that we're not always in blooming mode and it's not always spring, but that maybe, just maybe, like the death and decaying parts of life don't have to be so intimidating, because again, they're like so natural. So I think a lot of people are actually working towards death positivity in very like unconscious ways. Like I think a lot of like the witch community, I think, already does it by like thinking about what they're releasing or what they're trying to like put intentions into and building up during like, moon cycles or anything like that. I think there's just the grappling of like understanding the framework of what it means to be death positive will have you actually realizing people do more than they might think about like on the surface. But everybody's death positive journey will look very different. But I think it's so important to understand that there's discomfort there for a reason, because it is a big process. And so how do you have like tools to work through those things? And so if I can do it like on micro levels, as I'm like transitioning into like, right now I'm thinking about like how I'm going to transition myself energetically, psychologically, emotionally from moving where I live on my own to like moving in with like a partner. I'm going to have to think about what is being lost there, and also at the same time what is being gained. But I think in life we don't address fully what is being lost, and then we move into these situations questioning, why do I feel a certain way, when it's like just this honoring of what you're letting go and what you're coming into ceremoniously. Like I love putting that ceremonial touch on those kind of things. So thinking about even in those ways how I can honor those things through ceremony. And I think that's where the witchcraft comes in, because things mean something, whether it's color, whether it's plant allies, like more energy pushing you toward that next iteration of yourself, the better. And knowing over everything, it is like a very natural process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I super agree with you. I think one of the key things that I picked out from what you just said is like kind of coming to terms with the fact that it's more like transformation. And I totally feel that. I think one of like the most telling things, at least in like witchcraft or like witchcraft adjacent topics, is kind of like the meaning behind the death card in the tarot. When I first started reading, I think Hollywood really like plays into this a lot by like equating the death card in the tarot to like actual physical death, which like, I mean, like, I guess, but really it's a card of transformation and moving on from one point in your journey to the next. And it's not something that should be feared, even though change is scary. So I think it does acknowledge that in a certain way. But I have found that through my work with getting in touch with like the death archetype, I've become less resistant to change, which has helped me a lot. Would you say that maybe you have had some similar experiences, or how would you say like getting in touch with death or getting more acquainted with and comfortable with talking about this topic? How has that kind of changed your viewpoint on stuff?
I think it really makes me more conscious and aware. I remember when I was graduating with my bachelor's degree many, many years ago, and I just felt so uncomfortable in that moment. Like it just felt, and I did not have the words, I did not have the language. And so I coped in ways that were not really healthy in that moment. And then I remember like bawling my eyes out and just like feeling so overwhelmed by that very big moment of transition. Like your identity is so tied to certain things or to certain people. And I did not have any way of being able to say that or acknowledge that even to myself, and especially to other people, what I was feeling in that moment. So understanding this like life framework to death, and that it's not just something that will be limited to people who physically die, was really important for me. And like the death archetype helps me move through life's waxing and waning. Because also too, if you're looking at like psychology and the ways we experience life, grief is also not something limited to like people physically dying too. So when you understand that like you are going through a grief cycle when it comes to like the changing of a job or even your whole profession changing, like you losing a friend, like it's all these things that we like a lot of, there's like this ecosystem of like our self-identity that formulates and creates who we are and who we think we are and how we operate in the world. So if anything shifting or changing can lead to a lot of like negative emotions and grief, and just instability is like at the core of what makes me freeze up when I think of change. And so that is just like to having that consciousness and awareness beyond just like dealing with like physical death. I think that's really how it has shaped me and my navigating through the world.
Yeah, I feel like coming to terms with death is actually like a very grounding thing to do in a weird way. And I know that sounds like a little bit woo-woo or whatever, as I like to say, but I think it's really important in people's practices. So if you don't mind, I was going to shift the conversation just a little bit, though oh my gosh, I am having so much fun talking to you today. Oh my goodness. But I did notice that on your podcast, you kind of focus an episode on ancestor work, and like on your Instagram, it looks like you have been like getting some new books and all of that kind of stuff. So is this something that you are investigating? I don't do a whole lot of ancestor work in my practice. It's more, I focus on the deity side of things. But could you like maybe talk a little bit about your journey and maybe like kind of what the biggest takeaway or realization has been for you so far in this journey, if you don't mind sharing?
Yes, absolutely. Because I find this to be incredibly fascinating. So when anybody wants to speak on ancestor work, I'm like all ears. But with that being said, I don't fashion myself like an expert on this at all, and that there's like a huge foundation of other people's work and intellectual labor that I kind of ground my understanding of it. And a huge shout out to Mallory Voudois' book called, I think it's literally just called like Ancestor Work. I forget the title of the book, but it is amazing. And it is really instrumental in me feeling like I could process my grief. Like, even if you're not somebody who fashions himself like a really spiritual person, or I don't even know how to phrase that, but like somebody that doesn't necessarily like at face value feel comfortable, like it doesn't resonate with them to like kind of engage spiritually with like spirits. Just understanding that like the relationships you have with people don't have to end with their physical death was incredibly liberating for me to like realize. And so my spiritual journey in my young adult life has been heavily informed by the passing of my father when I was like 19 years old. And so that was like about a decade ago, but you still grapple with like what that means for you, who you are, your future, all of those things. And so what had me gravitating toward ancestor work was the idea I could kind of keep that relationship with him. And like any relationship, it evolves over time. So understanding that, you know, you might be really into putting energy into that relationship now, and then maybe it'll change depending on like your life circumstances. So actually viewing ancestor work as a way to keep and connect with people who you know who have passed away, or even just like ethnic or like religious and even like professional traditions. And so ancestor work is a practice of connection and contextualization. So like in the field of history where I've built my professional career, historical contextualization is like a key element of understanding like a historical figure or an event. So without understanding the roots of a person or event, you miss like a huge piece of what allowed change to take place over time. So I think figuring out your relationship to the people of the past, even not even like ancestrally in the most like literal sense, like I think even broadening it up, like when you think about like nationality as well, or even like your local community land that like maybe you're not like tied to them by, I don't know, genetics, even that is like, if you think about how actually like genetically close we all are. But like I think that there's just the kind of wrapping our heads around the fact that like we're actually more connected than we would think we are. So like I would have people kind of think about ancestor work in a way that like they again might actually be doing this work. Like as a historian, we keep memories and you honor and kind of venerate people in certain ways, and you talk a lot about death and dying when you think about like United States history. So a lot of what I like to think about ancestor work is also like people in my life, but also like thinking about how do you come to terms with our legacy like as a nation with death and what has been committed when it comes to like Native American genocide, the enslavement of human beings, wretched from their own like homes. So I think ancestor work is a social communal duty, but then also like very personal too. So there's like so much I could talk about that, and I'm still again pulling at the thread. But when it comes to my biggest takeaway is feeling like you have so much power and you're not at the whim of life, that there's so much of what like we do that is tied to the people who've come before us, and that by honoring life and the loved ones you have, it's something that is like this like daily practice. And so I know like we all live in this world today where like death is just so much everywhere. And sometimes like it's hard to like then come home to like your personal space and think about death more. It's a whole lot. Like the world is so wild, especially right now. And so I think honestly, like ancestor work could even be as abstract and vague and simple as like taking care of the people around you, because that's like what your ancestors would want you to do. It's just be present and be there with them and develop that relationship. So many people keep altars to their beloved dead who've died. They keep like, you know, a candle lit for them. They, you know, have silent suppers during Samhain. They have like myself, like candles dedicated to them that they'll like engage with, where they meditate, write them letters, all those things. But really super simple, like ancestor work is just taking care of the people in your life that you love, and acknowledging and understanding like the preciousness of life. That's been my biggest takeaway, is that like the life is so exhausting. You don't need to buy anything else. You don't need to do anything else except just like really be with your people and your community. Like, you know, going to a protest or like a march, like that is ancestor work, because like you're doing your people proud in service of like community and care. So that's kind of where my journey's been taking me, and I'd love to like unravel in like future podcast episodes.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I talk occasionally on my channel, or maybe before like a ritual if I'm hosting like a sacred circle or anything like that online, about connecting with the element of spirit and that spiritual ancestry that we have as witches and practitioners, because we have to remember that for generations before us, there were people who like weren't even necessarily practitioners, who died because they were like, you know, accused of practicing, you know, witchcraft, or, you know, we have these traditions that were passed down, and then like now I'm learning about them from people who maybe have like generations of witchcraft in their family, and that all kind of contributes to this like like kind of like what you were saying, this like community ancestorship, I guess, that we all as practitioners, like I'm indebted to these people because they kept those traditions alive for me to stumble across like at the local library in that dusty corner. And I'm like eternally grateful to those people. And I also think it's really important, I think I did an episode on like the Salem witch trials, and like none of those people were actually practitioners. They were just like women. So I like wanted to make sure that like they were all named. Like I made sure I sat down in that video and just was like, hey, like let's just take a second to remember these people and the atrocities that happened. So I love that you touched on the fact that it doesn't necessarily have to be, a blood relation or someone who is like physically related to you in some way, because I know that there are practitioners out there who may not know their lineage because they were adopted, or they just don't have that ability to access that, or maybe they just like had a falling out with their family and are just like uncomfortable kind of addressing that topic, or are maybe ashamed of their ancestors for some reason or another. But I think that, like what you were saying, it is important to like at least touch on that. It's something that I'm working towards as well, for sure. But I guess I was wondering, like, do you have like any like favorite ancestral practices that you have incorporated into your own, or how has like, it seems like you kind of work with some of your family members in terms of your ancestor work. So have they influenced your practice at all? Like, have you learned anything new about your family? Has it been this journey? I'd love to hear more about it.
For myself, I think it's like a really lovely journey because it's a lot of like having to come to terms with your grief. So if it's in my case, it's a lot of working with the spirit of somebody that I knew in my life, and a really important, crucial, like foundational figure. And so it's letting go of like expectation, and it's like mimicking real relationships, like people who are physically here, where you really have to like kind of let go in many cases the expectation, and kind of work in a way that you think would be the most effective way of like kind of communicating with that person. And for myself, I think it's coming to an acceptance even a decade later after his passing, like really being okay, like really trying to like sit with what that means, and thinking about the power of memory in that moment to be able to really evoke that person, and grasping, and really, because intellectually I could understand it, but like feeling their presence and allowing myself to be in their presence without expectation of return, or responding in a way that like I would think. It's kind of also like with like relationship, like love languages, where like you always have these like ways you expect people to speak with you and communicate to you, but being like open to like other things. I think that's been like super crucial. And I think it's really hard to put like kind of tangible explanations or like even words like around the experience, but I think it's a good mental practice in thinking about how I can invest time in a person, because I think life, it's so easy to move forward and not give that space, even if it's just like thinking about that person or talking with that person, with a family member, and not being afraid to be talking about them because of what emotions might come up. Like it's kind of like a muscle. I think memory is a muscle, and I think emotional memory works in a very similar way, where you have feelings that are attached to certain things. So it's a lot of like kind of dusting the cobwebs off of that memory and that relationship to that person, because it's just, again, and mimicking like the process to becoming like less afraid of death. It's like also becoming less disconnected from people who have died, because it is super hard to even think of them oftentimes in some cases. So for me, there's no expectation of them like reaching out or like responding or anything. It's like this idea of how can I invest energy in the same way, because I think there's like a whole part of us that like even when people physically die, you still like it feels like a phantom limb in many cases, where like you've always been so used to like investing that love and that time and that energy with them. And so still keeping that going and still having that space and that energy and putting that out into the world, and thinking about the many ways like it kind of goes and disseminates itself, is kind of, it's exciting in some ways, because I don't think the spirits of the people you love show up in the way that you would think. But anytime, like, I know I recently finished up my master's program, and I wore this ring I gave him. It said like dad, and I wore it with me on that day of graduation for like the ceremony. And then I took pictures with my family and stuff. And then I was looking back and I realized there's like one picture of me and my whole family. And I have like my hand up like this because the wind is blowing. And then his picture with the dad is like on the ring and like showing. So he's like literally in the photograph. So it's like those small things where like, I didn't necessarily feel like, oh, like I heard him say, you are like, I'm proud of you, Lauren. It's like there's that presence in those small things. Like if you're really open to it and you have that energy and you have that openness, you're so much more likely to see that. And I practice that when I walk around cemeteries, just being open to like that death energy. It's just that sensitive layer of life that like if you just keep moving through it and blowing past it, you won't be on that like level of openness to like kind of receive those things, however small.
Oh my gosh, I literally felt like you were like just speaking like to my soul, because like I feel that so hard, especially when I'm like at cemeteries and stuff. Like to me, death has like this I equate death with stillness and balance. So I find that it's very calming to be in cemeteries to me, and I understand that's probably set up a little bit that way. There's a lot of nature around, and the cemeteries I frequent are usually kind of abandoned. So maybe that might just be a little bit of an environmental factor, but I think that there is legitimately an energy there, no matter where I've been. The cemeteries have always kind of felt relatively similar to me. It's a place of reverence, it's a place of stillness, and it's a place where you kind of go back to connect, which I think is really, really beautiful. But one of the things that I think also stuck out to me is you were saying kind of like keeping these memories alive of people, and that phantom limb thing. There is this beautiful, my ninth grade English teacher told this to me, and I am not even 100% sure if it's true, but it's something that has stuck with me my whole life. And we were reading Beowulf for the first time, as you know, in high school. And he had mentioned that the Norse have this belief, or the Vikings and the ancient Norse culture had this belief, that you died twice. You die with your physical body the first time, and then you die when the last person who remembers you dies. So it's that idea of that person keeping you alive in the memory. It's just something that is so beautiful. And it really makes me feel like it kind of comes to me as a duty as well for me, even though I'm not involved with the Norse pantheon, but you know, to kind of keep the memories alive of people who have passed on, my friends who have passed on, family members, etc. Because it also brings me closer to the living, and it makes me want to remember those positive things about those people, so that way I can be like, oh hey, remember this person, like they were so cool, like back in like the early 2000s we did this, like, you know, or whatever, like when I'm a little old lady, like, you know, my little rocking chair. Do you feel that like investigating death work and like maybe some of that ancestor work, do you feel like that has brought you as well closer to the living, or maybe family members? How do you feel like that has helped you kind of like in this plane of existence?
Yeah, I think it's like really what you are speaking to, the avenues upon which you can then like kind of evoke their memory and all of that. And I think that's so lovely about that second death idea. And that's like probably what intrigues me so much about history, is being somebody who's like within that that industry, that professional world. And I think it's so much of like the parts of yourself that you don't feel comfortable addressing with the world that can become like really painful. And I know, especially with people responding to me talking about death in my personal life, and even like myself, when other people tell me about people that they're grieving, or, you know, even grief is like something that like is eternal, it never really ends. But I even kind of struggle to address their needs in those moments. Like it's such a big thing, and we may not always be equipped with like the right things to say. But I think that when it comes to me grappling with death, especially with close people who've died, I think it's only bettering my relationships with people who are alive, whether it's like romantic partners, friends, or family, because it's you are like the person that has so much like power to be able to change the way we talk about things like this. And I think the death work and like the death space itself intersects a lot with like social justice communities, because death is so closely related to so many like social and cultural issues that we deal with today. And so even doing like a small thing, like refusing to view death as a taboo topic and being openly vulnerable about your grief to your friends or online, I think that is like super transformative, not only for your own self and your own like emotional health, but also gives people permission to also do the same. So it's only been a betterment for me, and I feel more comfortable evoking memory with my family and doing more things at like a few, like the cemeteries, and doing those things, like having cemeteries be spaces of connection with my family is, I think, a really great byproduct of my project with the podcast.
Oh my gosh, I love that because you make all of this stuff seem so easy and like just like accessible, which is amazing. Like I'm like way less intimidated by ancestor work after talking to you, legitimately. But I guess like do you have any advice for any like novice practitioners who are maybe apprehensive about getting into death work or talking about death? Like, is there anything that you have, like any advice you have for beginners, I would say?
Yeah, I think to always think of yourself as a beginner. I am most definitely a beginner, but I think that like we all have an access point to death, even if it's like energetic death or people who physically died. Like I think we all are like experts at death, because like, and yet beginners at the same time, because we all experience death so uniquely and like differently than other people. And yet it's something we all are on equal planes with, because we will all die and people around us will all die. And I think of it like Harry Potter, like how you are initiated into death, and like how you have like the thestrals, which you don't see until you have been closely like impacted by death. And in the case of like the Harry Potter universe, it's like when you've seen death with like your own eyes. And I love that analogy, because I think death is something that like changes you when you've experienced somebody in your life physically dying and you are no longer who you once were. And just like how Harry sees the thestrals and he never has before, but because he was close to somebody who died, then you see that. I think the world becomes more illuminated and heightened when you experience death, or when you choose to be in closer proximity to it in the ways that like it pervades your life. So I think if there's anything I can recommend, it is to be okay that like your practice will ebb and flow with death work, and that energy is heavy, like it's so heavy. And especially with our world today, when like on the news, it's a lot of death. And then in your communities, in your lives, it's a lot of death too. So there's no wonder, like we come home to our personal spaces, and again, we're just like exhausted by having to process so many things. So I think like understanding that everything blooms, everything decays, everything dies, like you will be up and down with these things. Like I'm not always in death mode. Like that's not a thing. That's not balance. That's not like, that's not healthy. So I think it's like learning to like move in and out of that energy, and not being afraid when maybe it's been a minute since you've like to talk to somebody who is not on this plane, or maybe like even just going to a cemetery, just understanding that it's like anything, you need to be in that like kind of emotional space, but sometimes you got to push yourself to be in the emotional space if you feel like you're a little less than ready for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that to confront death is to be uncomfortable sometimes, and that's okay. It's not a bad thing. And I think that sometimes discomfort is necessary for growth, like in a reasonable amount. Obviously, I'm not saying like just go like only focus on death for like no one here is saying that, obviously, but I do agree that like it's okay. Like it in my life, it has been very beneficial for me to like kind of face that discomfort because ultimately it brings growth and change. So on that topic, I guess in terms of growth and change, what is kind of like your next step in your spiritual journey, death work, ancestor work, or just like your practice in general, if you wanted to chat about that a little bit?
So I was actually thinking about this recently. I really want to get closer to this oracle deck called the Embroidered Graveyard. It's actually made for shadow work, and also has like opportunities for you to like actually use it as a deck where you can communicate with like spirits. So I'm really interested in like getting into that. It's beautiful. It is the most moving like death iconography that I've seen in a deck. And so I think it's lovely because like it just kind of gives you that space, and there's like a beautiful book that is corresponding with it too, that like you can kind of utilize, and there's like spells and how to like use it. And so just kind of getting deeper into that practice. I think like having like a devoted candle or a devoted oracle deck, like those things helps kind of like create routine. So I think I'm looking for more routine, I think, trying to find some structure, some framework, something like in the morning or in the evening, like just that one thing that like either I start or end my day with this idea of death, to keep me conscious and aware of like the preciousness of life. So I think that's something I'm going to be working on this summer.
Oh my gosh, that is a beautiful and such a huge undertaking. Let me just say, oh my gosh, I am like so impressed because daily practice is super like, it's awesome. And I am so supportive of everybody who like strives towards that. I strive towards that myself. I try to do like a daily yoga, like / meditation session. It's like so much, but it's so awesome. And it really, I think when you do dedicate yourself to having those specific things or having those specific practices that you do kind of on a daily basis, it really brings that aspect of your practice into such a clearer focus. So by doing that, oh my gosh, I'm just so happy like to hear that you're doing that. It's amazing. Oh my gosh. Well, do you have any other like final thoughts or anything else that you wanted to just talk about? Anything at all?
I guess I'll just end on how I end all my podcasts. Death is only the beginning. It is the tagline of my podcast. And it's something that came from, funnily enough, one of my favorite movies called The Mummy, where that's like the last line as he like Imhotep goes down into the water. I think it's so true that like life doesn't end with death, and there's just so much more for yourself and for your relationships that I think could be like achieved through honoring those parts of yourself. And even though it feels weird, like for me to talk to people about death and my curiosity towards it and how I work with it in like both intellectual and like spiritual ways, it is so much of like what I feel like has made me who I am, and has shaped me into who I am. So I feel like death is truly just the beginning of our lives, never the end.
Oh my gosh, I love that. That is a beautiful note to end on. Lauren, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with me and for gracing my channel. Oh my gosh, it was such an honor to talk to you. So thank you so much. Everyone, go check out Lauren's page and her podcast and just everything. All of the links will be down below once again. And thank you guys so much. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.